and welcome to the NCCN Global Policy webinar, Patient Engagement Driving Access to Quality Cancer Care Globally, Patient-Focused Clinical Research and Advocacy. My name is Robert Carlson, and I am the CEO of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Today's webinar is the first of a series of 3 webinars focusing on global cancer policy. The second webinar will be held on May 20th, focusing on treatment and survivorship, and the third will take place on May 27th, focusing on policy and advocacy. NCCN is a not-for-profit alliance of 31 leading cancer centers dedicated to improving and facilitating quality, effective, efficient, and accessible cancer care. Through the leadership and expertise of clinical professionals at NCCN member institutions, NCCN develops resources that present valuable information to the numerous stakeholders in the healthcare system. NCCN guidelines and clinical content is utilized throughout the world. Of the 1.4 million registered users on our website, nearly half are located outside of the United States. This map shows the distribution of registered users, and as can be seen, they are located in nearly every country around the world. NCCN appreciates and recognizes the supporters and sponsors of this webinar series. Without this support, this webinar series would simply not be possible. Today's program will focus on the tools and policies that support patient engagement in and access to clinical trials. The program will begin with a presentation from Mr. Jan Geisler on patient-focused clinical trials. Next, we will hear from Dr. Abubakar Bello, who will discuss clinical trials and research in Sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, we will host a live panel discussion that will focus on strategies that improve patient-centric clinical research around the world. Our moderator for today's webinar is Dr. Weijin Ko. Dr. Ko is Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at NCCN. At this time, allow me to introduce our 2 keynote speakers. Mr. Jan Geisler is the founder and CEO of Advocacy, a think tank, consultancy, and social enterprise on patient advocacy and patient engagement in research that is based in Germany. Jan is a chronic myeloid leukemia survivor. During his treatment, he participated in a clinical trial and founded an online patient community, Leukemia Online. He has been a leader co-founding many organizations, including the CML Advocates Network, the European Cancer Patient Coalition, the Acute Leukemia Advocates Network, and the work group of European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks. We will then hear from Dr. Abubakar Bello, President of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer. Dr. Bello is the immediate past head of the Department of Radiotherapy and Oncology at the National Hospital Abuja in Nigeria, where he has served as a clinical oncology consultant and radiation oncologist for almost 15 years. Dr. Bello is also a member of the African Cancer Coalition and has contributed to the development of the NCCN harmonized guidelines for Sub-Saharan Africa for prostate, colon, rectal, and anal cancers. We are thrilled that Mr. Geisler and Dr. Bello are here today to share their expertise. Their presentations have been pre-recorded, but we welcome the opportunity for questions during the live panel discussion. We look forward to an active conversation today and welcome your questions and engagement throughout the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlson, for your kind introduction. I'm very happy to speak at this forum about the trials we want, a patient-focused approach to cancer research. My name is Jan Geisler. I'm founder and CEO of Advocacy. I've been a cancer patient for about 20 years and a passionate patient advocate that has been involved in founding a number of pan-European and international patient organizations. What I want to speak about is why industry and academic researchers, as well as regulators, should involve patient advocates when they run studies or plan to run studies. Because with all the talk about patient centricity, we need to move away from glossy statements on patient centricity, and we need to move really towards a real involvement of patients in plans, actions, and outcomes. And there's a lot that can be learned directly from patients, like gathering insights on the day-to-day reality of patients, what it really means to live with a disease as a family, as a patient, with the whole framework around the patient. And that's by far more than just clinical outcomes. It is to understand the real unmet need and the real value to patients, because we talk a lot about unmet need and we talk a lot about real value, but we very often then mean clinical outcomes, clinical need, or let's say system value, but not really what patients would value. Patients can also help to co-create trial services or info resources, because even though there's a lot of money in the system in healthcare, we need to invest more wisely into things that really benefit to patients and are really important. And that's why if we have better trial designs, more effective research, if we generate better data, then in the end, it's a wiser investment into scarce resources. Even though trials are expensive, we need to do that. And of course, patients can drive research. And I think we've seen a lot in rare diseases, especially, that the patient community took action because there was neither commercial nor academic interest to really put resources into that research. And that's why patients driving research is also very often the case. So why is it not enough just to ask physicians about their opinion, or doctor knows best? Because patients very often have a different opinion. And I just want to highlight survey data for Myeloma Patients Europe, which is just an example where you can see the difference. Because they did a survey to about 300 physicians and nurses, to about 260 patients and carers in 43 countries. And one of the questions in the survey they asked was, what are the treatment side effects with the most negative impact on overall well-being of myeloma patients? And you can see the blue bar are physicians, the orange bar are patients, and you can see that the bars are very strongly far apart on some of the attributes which I've highlighted here. So for example, hair loss was rated much lower than, for example, patients rated them. So physicians had a very, didn't give that so much priority. The same for neuropathy. You can see a large difference where, because it's a typical clinical issue, so physicians thought this has the most negative impact on patients, while only half of the patients actually thought that. And so you see that all across, and there's data on other cancers as well. And that's why it's very important not only to ask the ones that run the trials or that design the trials or are developing products, but those that are really affected, that need to live with the disease day by day, because they might agree and might have the same opinion, or they might disagree. And that's why it's important to talk. And again, I mean, regulators usually try to take decisions on specific rules, and they need to, let's say, find an average way how to get somewhere. If you just look at the graph, I mean, same disease, same stage, same age doesn't mean that the patients have the same preferences, even though this is very often the assumption in our healthcare systems and also in research. Patients are not the same. There might be patients which are more harm tolerant. There might be patients which are more harm intolerant. And the policymakers tries to find the middle ground between that. But conflicting attitudes when the medicine is associated with effects that some patients value more than others are based on individual preferences. So it's very important to look at that and look at patient preferences, not just take assumptions for subgroups without really looking into more details. And that's why, for example, patient preference studies are extremely important, because they can provide data on decision making. So preference vary from one stakeholder to the other, from one disease to another, or even without a single disease. And for example, the European Medicines Agency has run a pilot project with Myeloma Patients Europe and Melanoma Patients Network Europe on patient preferences. In this triangle, you see the typical triangle where you have the difficult trade-off in cancer between overall survival, severe, very acute toxicity, or long-term chronic toxicity. Not every patient sits on the same place, and we're trying to find a middle ground, but you might find out that specific subpopulations of the patients, for example, the younger, the working, or those that are looking after dependent family members, might have a very different preference on whether they prefer to hit it hard at the beginning, or can live with long-term toxicity, but they want to be there for the next couple of years, but don't prefer overall survival. There might be different preferences. And what I'm trying to say is it's important that with the patient community is to work that out and better understand that systematically, rather than just taking assumptions what patients want. That's very important. And also, it's very important that we think of research waste, because we as patients see too many studies that just are designed for specific interest or specific clinical outcomes, but they don't really take into account what really counts. And Ian Chalmers of the Cochrane collaboration has actually published that article in The Lancet in 2009, where he highlighted with the other authors that about 85% of research is being wasted because we either ask the wrong questions, or because we don't publish the results, or because the way we publish the results are being biased. I could talk about this for hours, but I don't have the time. But if we just look at the left column, are the questions relevant to clinicians and patients? And he has actually concluded that very often low priority questions are being addressed because they're either fashionable or because they are just priority, or a lot of people looking at a specific new biomarker. So there might be a lot of issues why low priority questions are being addressed, or important outcomes are not being addressed, or clinicians or patients not involved in setting research agendas. So all this is very important. And I think we all can't afford. We have about 200 different cancers and much more subgroups. If we continue with the current pace of research, it will take us another 200 years until we have a cure for every cancer. So we cannot afford to duplicate research or just to focus on low priority things that don't matter to patients. So out of that rationale, the different stakeholders have increasingly included patients in all different processes. The competent authorities like EMA and FDA, the policymakers when health policies being defined, or also research policy, ethics committees, the reimbursement agencies and HTA and clinical researchers, and also the public, because there's a lot of misconception in the public that research is for guinea pigs, or patients are guinea pigs on trials. So we need to work a lot on that. And I think on all that, patients are being needed to actually contribute from a supply to a demand-driven model. So to really make sure that all these different stakeholders deliver to patients' needs, which should be the intent. So what's the background on that? How do we get there? It's actually the systematic patient involvement in the design and conduct of clinical trials, and also on big data. And I'm going to bring some examples. But first of all, we need to discuss about, if we talk about the patient, from whom do we expect input? And if there are different categories, and I think there's a strong misconception because we just try to use the term patients for everything. But of course, there's individual patients and carers, and I usually say, if you want somebody to have to share experience on grade 3 diarrhea, ask somebody who's had grade 2 diarrhea, but don't ask a single patient what the whole community wants. That's what you have patient advocates for, because they have insight and experience of the whole community, of a larger population, also the subpopulations. When you think about the graph on patient preferences, that's what it is. Sometimes you also need patient organization representatives because you want to have like a voted opinion of a board on a specific policy. Then you need patient organization representatives. And for some technical discussions, like for example, clinical trial protocols, we need patients experts. So that could be any of the first 3 categories, plus technical training, how research works, because you cannot discuss about the trial protocol without the person understanding what the trial protocol is and what it contains, as an example. And that's why there is some criticism about patient experience data as it's being discussed currently, also within PFDD and so on, because we sometimes hear, but we're involving patients. But what we find out as patient advocates is that there's a cherry picking of a small number of patients for focus groups, and they provide opinions, but it's not really systematic assessment on the insights and needs of the different patient communities. And that's why we need to be very careful who we ask when we take decisions. And patient advocates are usually the ones that really have community insight and also understand populations that are different than myself, being at my age and in my specific situation. So now when we talk about very practical things like clinical development in practice, I mean, we're sometimes talking like this is a new invention, but if you look at that roadmap, which we've published some years ago on clinical development, from setting research priorities over research and clinical trial design and planning, over implementing clinical trials, to if it's a phase 3 study, going into market authorization. All these black texts are actually points where the HIV community, for example, has engaged with researchers and regulators and industry for about 20 years. So it's not a new invention, and patients can contribute in a meaningful way to any of these points. And I'm just going to, because we're talking about trial design and cancer research at the moment, I'm just highlighting some of the discussions that we, for example, in my CML community, my cancer community, regularly have with industry and academic researchers. For example, talking about patient priorities and risk benefits. So how do you weigh up risk and benefit? And that's a huge discussion. And sometimes there are misconceptions, what kind of risk we are willing to take, and that we don't want to take, let's say, unnecessary risk, but we also see the benefits. And we're not asking just for new drugs. We have a very rational mind about to strike a balance. Patient relevant endpoints. The trial might prioritize 2 clinical endpoints, like survival endpoints, while patients probably in progressive disease might say, but quality of life is equally important. So probably we need to discuss, is there a secondary endpoint on PRO? And if we talk about PRO, are we using the right measures that will actually give a meaningful impression on what is really important to patients? Because very often PRO are just used to have PRO data because the regulator asks for it, or because reimbursement agencies want to see the EQ5D, but we don't really measure the stuff that really matters to take decisions if we have 2 therapies on equal, let's say, effectiveness, to really take decisions which one probably make a difference in patients' lives. Then also inclusion-exclusion criteria. If you look at my disease, average age on the typical phase 3 study is 47. The incidence of my disease is 65. I was diagnosed at 28. But if you see the exclusion criteria, quite often we have to discuss those, because in the end, we get a very good population to actually measure therapeutic difference between 2 groups. But in the end, they're 20 years younger, so you exclude the people which might have cardiovascular disease or diabetes or whatever, which a lot of people, elderly cancer patients, actually have as other diseases. Then, of course, I can't go into everything, but also the frequency of diagnostics. We had discussions about, do we need to do bone marrow biopsies to pediatric patients so frequently, because no parent will actually enroll their kids into these studies if you insist on that. And that was a discussion I had with a company, and they changed their protocol because otherwise no patient would have joined that pediatric study. Then, of course, ethical aspects. We have discussed very often about the ethics not doing crossover and letting patients stay, or forcing people to stay on therapeutic arms, even though their cancer progresses. That's unethical. And even though I know from a systematic and from a data point of view, it's more difficult to actually introduce crossover, what does it help if you have a dropout rate from that study because you have not offered that? And then, of course, feasibility, and we're going to have a speaker later on about Sub-Saharan Africa. But if we just think about feasibility, we always see the same studies in the same centers in EU Big 5, EU Big 8, plus US and Canada. But in the end, the population that would desperately need that, and where we would actually need to see whether it also meets the needs of the community somewhere, or where an unserved population is that would probably like to join a study because there's not so much on the market on standard of care. We often have these discussions in feasibility, and we see that we are being involved very, very late in that process. So that needs to be looked at. So I hope that gives you a bit of an impression of the discussions we have. And we're not saying we're better scientists. We're saying we want meaningful trials. And that's why it's worth to discuss these factors at the time of design stage, because what does it help if these points, for example, a non-meaningful patient-reported outcome or quality of life instrument, the wrong endpoints, or a very artificial population, or whatever, or a huge dropout rate turns up later on, and then regulators will actually reject that therapy from patient access because they say the data is not meaningful enough. So it's really, really useful to have those conversations. And for example, in CML and many other cancers, the patient community tries to have that conversation with the decision makers. And that's a slide that Bettina Rill has actually presented very often, and she's going to be on the panel later on. You can see that the impact on patients is on the left side, because that's the design stage, and I've highlighted why it's so important. What actually current patient involvement is very often that we're being called when phase 3 actually is either just about to be launched, or when, let's say, we're talking about reimbursement and HTA decisions. That's where we are mostly involved, but that's where we can't change much than saying yes or no about data that has already been generated. And that's why key message is we need to be involved on the left side at the design stage to make good studies, and not later on being involved in saying whether the study is good or bad. And I just want to, as a last point, highlight practical involvement. And this is a project where I am involved. It's the Harmony Alliance is one of the largest big data projects in Europe. It's a consortium project of, I think, 56 different consortium members, where big data pools are being built across about 10 hematological diseases, where academic data, industry data is being pooled to actually do big data analytics and to identify signals, for example, on gene-gene interaction or gene toxicity interaction, whatever. And I'm leading the patient contribution to that. We provide a hub for the relevant patient umbrellas that actually contribute through one work package that we lead into providing input on the big data research proposals that are being submitted, on the data pseudonymization procedures, on the ethical framework, and also on, let's say, getting the patient public involved, and also on definition of core outcome sets for those hematologic malignancies. And I think that's I would say, a shining example, because it shows we're not just part of an advisory board that meets every 6 months where we provide some input, and whether it's being taken up or not, we never hear. We're really involved all across in the steering committee as work package leaders and in the different work package to really contribute with meaningful input into the different streams of such a complex big data project. And because there's no shortcut to knowledge, I mean, I've been in patient advocacy for quite a while, but I had to learn the hard way how research works. And because we wanted to make that more easy, we as a community have set up the European Patients Academy, an EU-funded project of 33 consortium members, which is about half industry, half public partners, led by the European Patients Forum initially, and then taken over by a foundation we set up in Holland to actually train patients about medicines, R&D, and regulatory affairs end to end. You can see the topics on the right side, which are being covered, all the different aspects, more than 3,000 articles, everything released under Creative Commons, and released in, I think, 12 languages on our website, which you can find on the bottom, toolboxpatientsacademy.eu, which really tries to build capacity in the patient community that if researchers want to involve us, that on our patient side, there are patient advocates that can really speak about research and contribute in a meaningful way because they understand the system and can then actually contribute to the process of defining more meaningful research. So with that, I would conclude the trials we want. Please involve the cancer patient community in the design of cancer research. And I hope I have given you some insights into practical approaches, how it can actually involve us, and also where the patient community can get the training to actually be meaningful partners. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. And my topic today is increasing patients' access to clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Dr. Bello Abubakar, a clinical and radiation oncologist at the National Hospital in Abuja, Nigeria, and the president of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer, IOTIC. As for conflicts, I have none. So by way of preamble, let us look at the cancer incidence and cancer mortality in Sub-Saharan Africa. You will see that according to the Globacam 2020, Africa accounts for 5.7% of the world cancer incidence, but also accounts for 7.2% of the mortality. Comparing that with the Americas, which accounts for 20.9% of the incidence, but has 14.2% of the mortalities. What does that tell us? It tells us that more people die of cancer from Sub-Saharan Africa compared to the Americas, compared to the Europe, and even the Oceania. Again, when you look at the ranking of cancer premature mortality, you will see that the first countries are Europe, America, and so on. But the ones with the highest premature mortality as a result of cancer are all in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that is where you see red. This is Africa in the middle. I hope you can see that. And you can see all the red have the highest mortality. And this coincide with the low human development index as compared to high human development index in the in Europe and in Americas. So this is not unconnected with so many of the things that we are really going to talk about. The increase, there is going to be an increase of incidence by 2020, and in fact, Africa is projected to bear the burden of cancer by 2040, with the Western Africa, Middle and Eastern African countries having over 100% increase in cancer. If you look at the graph, this is Africa in green, and the rest is after it, you can see that the prevalence is going to increase significantly. The incidence is going to increase significantly unless something fundamental is done. So why is the mortality increasing? We do know that late presentation, yes, a lot of African cancer patients present very late, usually stage 3 and 4, and that is because of so many factors: lack of awareness, lack of advocacy, lack of treatment, fear of treatment, and so on and so forth. But even the early presentations, there is always a poor outcome. Why is that? Are the drugs that we are administering to our patients, chemotherapy drugs, biologics, targeted, are they tailored for the African population? Could clinical trials have helped in better outcome? These are questions that we will hope to answer as we move forward. Look at the distribution of clinical trials being conducted globally as of June 11, 2019, as per clinicaltrials.gov. If you look critically here, you will see that Africa has only about 3% of the global clinical trials that are being conducted. North America accounts for 44%, while Europe accounts for 28%. Looking at the distribution again, you will see that again, if you look at Europe, for example, there were 88,407 clinical trials being conducted in 2019. In Africa, it accounts for only 10%. 10% of that number, I'm not even talking of the United States and Canada. This is Europe that is very close to Africa. So 10% is the only thing that is being conducted. And when we look at this paper, Landscape of Oncology Clinical Trials in Africa, that was published as Oncology Clinical Trials in Africa, Emerging and Operational Issues. Folakemi et al. Showed that despite the genetic diversity of the African population, only about 2.5% of all clinical trials globally have been done in Africa. Precisely 109 oncology clinical trials could be identified in the whole of Africa. And they are largely concentrated in Egypt, South Africa, Algeria, and Kenya. Meanwhile, 36 countries out of the 54 African countries have no record of any oncology clinical trials. And this is very sad. And Africans are also not included in clinical trials of disease like prostate cancer that predominantly affect Black men. In fact, in latitude and stampede trials on abiraterone, which is used primarily for the treatment of prostate cancer, the trials excluded Africa completely, while we have the highest mortality and the highest prevalence of prostate cancer. Why is that? These are questions that need to be answered. So, clinical trials in developing countries, such as Africa, is really problematic. There are so many reasons. And we do know that many of the citizens are living in poverty. Africa sometimes is defined as the land of poverty in the middle of so much. Why that is happening are questions that are begging for answers. Citizens bear a high burden of disease. We constitute about 20% of the inhabitable earth. We are about 1.2 billion people, which account for 16.7% of the world population. We have the world's poorest inhabited continent. We have a life expectancy of less than 60 years and an average income of $2,000 or about $5 per day. And this often put basic healthcare out of the reach of most citizens. This is very sad statistics, but it is the reality. It is the reality that we are facing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we are also underrepresented in clinical trials. And that is very disturbing. While it has a large ethically diverse population that bear a high burden of many diseases, we are still underrepresented. The populace is often poor and can't afford health care, and we are still underrepresented. We have inadequately funded and staffed national, regional, and local healthcare entities. Yet, Africa is underrepresented in clinical trials. Even when you look at people of African descent in different parts of the world, in fact, in the United States, African Americans constitute about only 6% of the NIH-funded clinical trials. And globally, people of African descent, like I mentioned earlier, represent only less than 3% of clinical trials that are being conducted. And treatment are often given to patients that have not adequately been tested on these patients' population. So most of the drugs that we use in Sub-Saharan Africa are just thrown to us without necessarily undergoing any clinical trial in our environment. Oncology clinical trials in Africa will offer benefits, not only for the local populace, but for the whole world. It will help identify biological underpinnings in cancer contributing to disparities. It will also help in identifying what cancer treatment are the most beneficial for people of African descent. Thus, addressing the difficulties encountered in conducting clinical trials in Africa could lead to globally impactful and innovative clinical trials. When you look at clinical trial versus standard of care, it is important to recognize that clinical trials involve human subjects, test and intervention, be it a product, procedure, or healthcare system, in order to improve standard of care. Measures effect over a period of time must have a comparison control group, must have method to measure intervention. And this is all captured in the protocol, and this must be stuck to meticulously if the question is to be answered. It also focuses on unknown effects of intervention and must be done before medication is part of standard of care. When we look at standard of care, it's all about clinical judgment decision and flexibility and it is usually within your clinical judgment. So clinical trials validate and standardize standard of care. So what justification would Africa have to adopt any standard of care for drugs that have not been used or have not been put to clinical trials in its populace? This is another question that we are still asking. And again, you look at it that clinical trials are lucrative business. It is estimated that it cost about $44.2 billion to as of today. And the global market is expected to rise to about $68 billion by 2026. And the cost of bringing new drugs to the market is between $637 million to $1.2 billion per drug. And of course, the oncology segment is expected to experience the fastest growth. So identifying avenues whereby safe, cost-effective clinical trials can be performed is a high priority for trial sponsors. And I bet Africa is one of those places that you can perform better clinical trials. You look at results, you see that for approximately every 5,000 to 10,000 compounds that enter preclinical testing, only one is approved for market. The cost of failure has to be borne by the price of one that is successful. So if clinical trials are being conducted in Africa, the results are not going to be so different from what we have around the globe. So what are the IOTICS initiative? The African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer, my organization, has started doing a couple of moves to enable us bring about clinical trial or to enhance clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that we've started is the IOTIC Cancer Genomic Conference that was held in February that drove the roadmap to global cancer equity, especially in clinical trials. Many people participated. It was such a huge success. And we were able, at the end of it, to have a clinical trial special interest of IOTIC. So when you look at the IOTIC clinical trial special interest group, what exactly are we looking at? That group will saddle with the responsibility of promoting research culture among African health professionals. Is to educate researchers on the essence of adhering to good practice. It is to improve the quality of research from the continent by way of doing more clinical trials and create a consortium of researchers working within Africa to enforce collaboration and expand activities and infrastructures. You know that in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the researchers are individuals that come from out of Africa to do research and take specimens. We want to make sure that there is a consortium where people can exchange ideas on how to develop all the research and the trials. We are also to inculcate research as a basic for evidence-based approach to the cancer burden in Africa, and to serve as a guide to conduct clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. We are to create a virtual platform for sharing experience to identify gaps and solutions. We do know that there are a lot of gaps in doing clinical trials, infrastructure, manpower, and so on and so forth. And we also want to create a lot of activities around the globe by creating something like clinicaltrials.gov/Africa, where all the clinical trials being conducted in Africa will be on that website. We want to have a network of different research groups with similar interests and set out activities to promote multi-center participation in trials performed on the continent. And we are also going to have a publication, Basics for Conducting Clinical Trials in Africa by IOTIC, which we hope will be a guide to prospective clinical trial sponsors and researchers. We are also going to engage the farmer and also the funders from around the globe that have interest in clinical trials in Africa. We do know that it is an expensive venture, but it is important that we engage farmers to find out exactly what are the limitations that is making clinical trials difficult in Sub-Saharan Africa. And to also work as facilitators and provide expert backup for design, protocol, and conduct of clinical trials in Africa. And we are to source for funding to improve capacity for clinical trials across the continent. And already IOTIC is working with us called the NCI to facilitate clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what are my final thoughts? Most clinical trials of drugs are never conducted in Sub-Saharan Africa, yet most of our standard of care are from the same clinical trials. Going forward, it is imperative that Africans and persons of African ancestry must be included in clinical trials, especially phase 3 drug trials that are being conducted around the world. The NCCN should help IOTIC in moving this agenda forward, and the time to act is now. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Geisler and Dr. Bello, for your insightful presentations. I'd like to now welcome them, as well as Ms. Moran and Dr. Rao, to join us on this panel discussion. So since we've already had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Bello and Mr. Geisler, if Ms. Moran, if you can start by giving a few words of introduction to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about why you find yourself on this panel discussion.
Sure, thank you so much, Dr. Ko, and I want to thank NCCN for this opportunity to join you today. My name is Hazel Moran. I head up our Global Patient Insights and Advocacy team at EMD Serono, which is a biopharmaceutical business of Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany. And essentially why I'm on this panel is a couple things. My role within the company is to really elevate the voice of patients and patient advocates and caregivers within our drug development lifecycle. And with myself and our team, we really work as connectors with the patient advocacy community. And in 2019, we brought together some global patient organizations for a meeting and got their feedback on patient-focused drug development that's developing, in the US and also in the EU. And I'm proud to say in 2020, we issued a commitment statement in support of patient-focused drug development that really articulates how we value and view, listen to and learn from the perspectives and lived experiences of patient advocates and their families. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Moran, and Dr. Rao, thank you for joining us. I would pose to you the same question. If you can give us an introduction, and why do you find yourself on this panel?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Bettina Rühl. I founded a European patient network in melanoma after, unfortunately, my husband died of the disease in 2012. And by training, I am a trained physician. I studied medicine in Germany and in France, and then pursued a PhD in the United Kingdom, working on developmental biology, and got kind of stuck in research, and followed up with a postdoctoral position in Sweden, where I continue to live and where my husband also died. And because a little bit of my background, I think it's not a surprise that I've always been interested at the interface of medicine and research. And at the time he was diagnosed, the standard of care was chemotherapy, and that was never effective in melanoma, unfortunately. So the only way to access potentially effective new therapies, and we knew what has happened in melanoma. I mean, it was a real change in the disease, was in clinical trials. And the designs were horrendous to be subjected to. So that was a very personal entry point into this area of patient-centric drug development and clinical trial design. And this is how it started. It started with a very personal observation and a shock that something that I would have considered as great and fantastic research as a professional turned out to be so horrendous when you're subjected as the patient to it, and that felt so wrong. And this is kind of my motivation in a way. I think that keeps me till today. And from there, one thing led to the other. So I have chaired the ESMO, the European Society Medical for Oncology's Patient Advocacy Working Group for 4 years. And since October 2019, I'm a member of the Cancer Mission Board working on the research strategy for Horizon Europe and cancer. So it has kind of one thing links to the other. And I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Thank you very much for your perspective and all your efforts. As we launch into the discussion session, I'd like to point out to the audience that some of the questions posed have already been answered directly by Mr. Geisler in the question and answer box with useful links provided. And as you ask more questions, we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So let me start with a question focused on Mr. Geisler and Dr. Ruhl. Mr. Geisler made a great argument for involvement of patients early. And he suggested that by asking patient-relevant questions early in the clinical trial design process, it can help reduce waste. And obviously, while there are multiple facets to research, economic considerations are very important. He referenced over $85 billion a year in wasted, if you will, maybe using the wrong term, but wasted research efforts or things that are not answered. So first question is to you, Dr. Ruhl. Given the significant economic argument, why do you think patients are still not involved in setting the research agendas?
So I think they're different. It's a multi-level question, actually, because one of the things is like the problem to study, and then it is how you actually study it. And both is relevant for patients. So if you look at how we think about problems, and I mean, this is now just like, if you think about drug development as an economically driven process where it is as much about placement on the market later on. So if we take that part aside, because that's not scientifically driven, that is market driven. But if we look at a research question, I think something that I have noted when swapping sides basically is that you start looking at problems from a different angle and you take a different approach. For example, and I think that often what we don't do is we do not formulate our research questions accurately. And that then leads to a lot of waste further down. To give you a concrete example, so as I said, I'm in melanoma. We had a number of targeted therapies. They unfortunately come with resistance. The research question, the unspoken that was out there was, tell us a mechanism of resistance. And this is what we got. We got a whole phone book of possible resistance mechanisms. However, that was nearly never, ever the question. The real question is, what is the relevant mechanism of resistance? Because if you have a patient, that's what you try to answer. In research design, that drives a totally different approach to the problem. So, and I think that's where we often go wrong. And I think working with patients in a correct way, and I don't think that patients, and I know that's not very popular in my own community, have all the answers. I think it is finding a way how to look at problems in a moderated process. I mean, problem solving, there are tons of things out there. Business, I mean, startups work like that. Allows you to get sharper at the problem and make sure that you phrase your initial question right. I think that's an important piece of work. And the conduct, of course, I mean, we know that we know how trials work. You randomize to the cheapest drug you can find that will give you the largest effect size because that keeps your trial costs down. And unfortunately, those are the trials that are highly unpopular with patients. So the usual story how that works is the trial does not recruit. Pharma comes to us and says the trial does not recruit. Can you help us? You look at the design and say, well, with that design, I'm not surprised it doesn't recruit. And then you do this iterative, like in an iteration, and eventually they amend the trial design after it has cost really a lot of money. And that's, of course, total waste. And it's frustrating for every side. So I think we have come to an understanding with a few companies and also academic groups that having designs that patients want to be on is the best way to fix the problem. So design trials that are good for every single patient on the trial. Because this argument, oh, you will get the standard of care. If the standard of care is useless, that's no promise, that's not good enough. So I think that's where patients can really help. And it's a benefit for both sides. Patients get better trials, they're cheaper, they're faster, they recruit better. And if you start with the correct angle in there, and it's not just clinical trials, because you have to get the original research question right to link into the trial. So I think we are an outside perspective, and I don't think we have all the solutions, but as part of the ecosystem, I do think that we're able to put the pressure and the urgency on the points that matter. Sorry, I can't put it shorter. It's still something I'm thinking about because it's something I've been worried about for a long time, but one day I'll have it down to 2 sentences.
Oh, good. I'm glad you are leading the charge now. I'm also going to build on something that Mr. Geisler showed, actually something building on what Dr. Rao herself had done, that patient involvement is often included at later phases of clinical trial design. So this question is posed to Ms. Moran as someone representing industry and who has an interest in patient engagement involvement. How are you actively pushing that patient involvement using some of the examples that Mr. Geisler gave to push it further upstream in the development of clinical trials and not just at the late phase 3 or marketing portion?
Yes, thank you for that question. We view patient-focused drug development, patient engagement as a cornerstone of the new model of drug development. And it is quite new for many companies. But I can say, even before the advent of PFDD, we have been involving patients earlier in our development through ad boards or focus groups, in clinical apps, and really trying to understand what works for patients in terms of trial sites and design. We recognize, though, that there is a need to be involved with patients and have patient voice at the table much earlier on in the development phase. So in 2018, we launched a partnership actually with the Accelerated Cure Project, which is a patient organization that supports patients or individuals living with MS. And we worked with them to really start to develop some of these clinical trial endpoints that are meaningful to patients, and really working with a cadre of patient advocates and lay patients, individual patients, to really understand what is meaningful in terms of treatment benefits. And I'm excited to also say that EMD Serono or Merck KGaA Darmstadt, Germany, has entered a collaboration with the Patient-Focused Medicines Development Organization. And we are very much in real time partnering with them to implement a newly released how-to guide for how to involve patients earlier on in clinical development. So this is actually hot off the presses. In the how-to guide was developed in March, and we are now very much in the midst of working with PFMD to really outline the structured framework. And it's too soon to report what's happening, but I think the good news is we all see the value and benefit. And what led up to this partnership was really getting a cultural buy-in and really having our researchers and leadership understand the value that patient voice has when it comes to trial design, so that it's meaningful. And so we're excited to be part of this collaboration, because at the end of the day, it's a win-win for both industry and the patients that we serve to obtain better quality data, and perhaps even strengthen the relevance of these studies to really match up to the unmet patient needs. So I can tell you, it really is maybe working with groups like Patient-Focused Medicine Development, really understanding together, co-creating a model that will help bring these voices to the table early on. And by doing this, we view patients as innovation partners. So maybe I'll have the chance to report back how that's going, but wanted to share that that's very much in real time, a new collaboration that EMD Serono has.
Well, we look forward to further updates from you and learning from you. So here's a question for Mr. Geisler and Dr. Ruhl. I was struck with how much you impressed on all of us, the importance of the patient, the center patient, and something from your bio, Dr. Rose, talked about patients are the primary data source. So in terms of involving patients, a question to both of you is there a role not just of involving patient voices early, but patient voices continually? So if patients are indeed the actual most important source of data, to capture that continuously. I mean, historically, we've captured clinical information episodically, but now, and you refer to it, Mr. Geisler, in terms of patient-reported outcomes of interest, can that, using current technology, be captured on a continuous basis rather than episodically? So perhaps turn this over to Dr. Rao while he's,
okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So what I meant with this, with the primary data source, is that I think one has to be a bit careful that we talk a lot about patients and patient involvement, but effectively what we often do is we study patients. So we consider patients as study objects and then call that patient-centric. So I, in my previous life, have worked with fish, zebrafish, and I've studied zebrafish. I would have never called myself a zebrafish-centric researcher, and everyone thinks it's ridiculous. But people are very happy to go around calling themselves patient-centric while studying patients. Now, from a research perspective, I think the important point in there is if I am studying something else, I am imposing my view of the world onto that problem. And the way I phrase my questions will influence what I get back from that source. And that introduces a bias that is caused by myself. It is the onlooker. As we say, the beauty is in the eye of the onlooker. The same is true for research. And I believe that the value comes if we turn this around and if we find a way and look at what patients volunteer, what matters to them. I totally get we need validated tools on that, but there has to be a space where we truly unbiasedly find out what is really truly important to the patient at the base. That's also important for patient advocates like myself, because, we all have a personal experience. Jan has his personal experience with the disease. I have a very different one. And while they are valid as such, they are very different. And we have to reconcile that in our own audience. And if we look at our own communities, it's about understanding what matters to people. It's not about doing right by some hypothetical average patient, which does not exist. Our ambition should be to do right by the individual. So it is about thinking how we deliver what matters to the person. And I think that is that is my motivation. That would be, I think that's where we should be going to. And that's the ambition that we as a network try to pursue. Because it doesn't matter what I think or feel. It's something what matters to the individuals in a very diverse group that matters.
Thank you. Mr. Geisler.
Well, I think it's important to always think about what do patients really want. And I think early engagement is extremely important when you ask patients very early. Let's put it in a different way. So if everybody thinks that we know what patients want, but in the end, it's important that you really collect it from the community as the primary data source, as Bettina also said. And that's something we have been engaged on as a community very strongly, called evidence-based advocacy, because we say we need to collect the data from the community, because we cannot just assume that when we ask a couple of patients or when we ask a couple of key opinion leaders that we really know what it is. And of course, now digital technologies give us a lot of opportunities to not only ask them every quarter year when they turn up in studies in the clinic to fill out pages of pro-questionnaires, but we can use data capture, we can use apps and all kinds of things to actually capture patient reality more clearly. And I think that's important, but we need to make use of that. And I think that's why it's important that we're engaged in the design phase of clinical trials, because what we see at the moment is that most studies don't make use of these kind of things. They don't make use of technologies. They don't make use of the right pro instruments. They don't make use of these kind of apps. And they probably use the right instruments, but at the wrong time points. So not when it's really, let's say, captures relevant issues. And I think that's where we can help a lot in the design phase to actually think about how can we capture these kind of real life experiences of patients during studies, but also how can we feed what the patient community gathers in day-to-day support to the patient community and feed that into the design process. So I think these two things are really important.
Thank you. Dr. Bello, segueing a little bit to, the challenges you presented in Africa, and you pointed out, the lack of clinical trials, and thank you for your leadership in aortic in setting up some of the processes to facilitate clinical trials. But you may have a chance now to get things right the first time rather than trying to correct the system. So as you're setting up these processes, one question is, how are patients, patient advocacy, patient organizations involved in your designing of these clinical trials processes? And there's a question from the audience to say, as a patient from an underdeveloped country, I would like to know if there are any trainings and resources available for that patient to become more involved that are specific to Africa. I mean, Mr. Geisler and Dr. Ruhl have talked about many resources available. They are from, more of a European-centric perspective, but how can we then bring this down to the granular level of where the need is?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good question. And thank you for the attendee that asked that very important question. I think it's Ikram from northern part of Africa. Yes, we have totally a different ballgame here in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we have to take one thing at a time. I totally agree that we cannot finish everything at once. Importantly is to start. And we have started doing something. We have a special clinical trial, special interest group in aortic. That is our organization, the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer. And one of their key fundamental objective is to really create advocates, be it patients, carers, and experts in clinical trial that will engage not only pharma, but also policymakers. You'll be surprised to know that there is no real funding in most of the African countries for clinical trials or for research. It's only recently that I found out that even the Nigerian government, through the tertiary education fund, have actually been appropriating money for research and clinical trials. Yet a lot of the researchers are not even aware, talk less of accessing those funds. So it is important that there is an organization that will go out and educate people to use those funds for whether it's to have advocacy across board or whether to engage people for training. We have so many clinical trialists in the diaspora. If you go to the United States, there is no single cancer institute that you not find Africans doing a lot of research. So we're trying to engage them so that they will come and develop capacity, because we've realized also that capacity is not simply here. Most of the research that have been conducted, that 3% that I have mentioned, the 3% that has been mentioned are not actually conducted in Africa. There is usually collaboration with institutions where specimens and biologics are taken out of Africa and the research are conducted elsewhere. And that has hindered the development of capacity in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we want to make sure that going forward, the research is actually being conducted here in Africa. And amazingly, the pharma has literally, I don't know why, for no real reason, I have been unable to find the reason why pharma are not engaging research institutions in Africa when they are conducting clinical trials. In my talk, I made mention of just 2 clinical trials that are very important for prostate cancer, and yet Africa was not involved. And these are some of the things. If you look at there are so many other clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer, HER2 positive disease, and so on and so forth, that should have involved clinical sites in Africa, but there are literally none. So advocacy is going to be very critical, and involving our researchers in the diaspora to create awareness and also to train clinicians in research and clinical trials to develop capacity. I think these are some of the things that we have already institutionalized. And then the Cancer Genomic Conference that we've had in February has actually involved a lot of the clinicians in the diaspora, and they are beginning to be aware of the needs in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we hope that this conference is going to continue on a yearly basis, and it is going to open the eyes of the clinicians and the researchers that are here in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. No, and you're right. You know, it is wonderful to have all of you be participants, you know, in this conversation. But as been pointed out, this is an ongoing series, and we want to raise awareness, but we want to take action. So here's a challenge that maybe I can rechannel from Dr. Bello to Ms. Moran. What are the impediments, or what are the possible incentives to pharma or you know, other companies to really help support clinical trials in Africa, specifically Sub-Saharan Africa?
That's a great question, and I can say I know we have a few trials in South Africa and other countries in Africa. I would say one of the big challenges really is capacity building, as Dr. Bello had indicated. We at EMD Serono actually partner with the American Cancer Society's Global Health Program to help actually build capacity on the health delivery side for patients in low to middle income countries, including Uganda and other countries in Africa. I think the challenge really is, I think I took a note with what Dr. Bello said about engaging the research institutions in Africa. I think when we think about access, these trials will happen where healthcare delivery is good. So what we as an industry recognize is that we need to partner with healthcare providers that are actually treating underserved populations. And we need to actually do a better job of building trust within communities and really building capacity of the local sites to partner with communities that traditionally haven't been able to access clinical trials. So I can't say that we're doing that perfectly. There's certainly a lot of work that has to be done, but it's through dialogues like these that we can really learn from one another. And my role in the company is to help elevate and connect the dots and help share best practices and knowledge that are in the external environment with our teams. So I accept the challenge, and really do want to learn more and figure out ways that we can help promote this further.
Awesome.
Great. So this is a question for both Dr. Bello and for Dr. Ruhl and Mr. Geisler. Have we, and this is not just unique in Sub-Saharan Africa, this is also true in clinical trials in other more developed areas of the world, that there is poor participation. Have we as a cancer investigation community not done a good enough job of promoting the benefits of clinical trials? Let me clarify that by saying, with NCCN, each of our guidelines says that we believe that the best treatment for any patient is on a clinical trial, and it's strongly encouraged and supported. And we do know that patients who are treated on a clinical trial, no matter what arm of the clinical trial, they get better outcomes than standard of care, as Dr. Bello somewhat alluded to. How do we pass on this message to participants, to patients, to healthcare providers, that involvement in clinical trial actually gives the best treatment, regardless of the trial study. Maybe I can ask that of Mr. Geisler first.
Well, I'm not 100% sure I could sign up for that, because there are good trials and bad trials. And patients only sign up for good trials if they're convinced that, because I mean, there's some level of altruism, but in the end, patients decide for their own good, and they decide because they're convinced they might be better off joining a clinical study. And of course, it's a difference if it's a phase 1 against a phase 3, and whether you're comparing against standard of care. And like Bettina was saying, sometimes for effect size, you the sponsors select comparative treatment that is probably not up to what is out there, and then patients don't join. So what we need to design, of course, is good studies that patients want to join because they're convinced that's right. And of course, there's a lot of misconception out there, because we have two different dimensions which we need to talk about. Are trials safe? Are they well monitored? Are they ethical, and so on? And there's a lot of safeguards, especially if you look at developed the areas like the markets in Europe, in the EU, or in the US. There's a very strong regulation. So I would say, from a technical point of view, having bad trials conducting them is quite difficult. But of course, you could still ask the wrong question or have the wrong comparator. That's totally legal, but still suboptimal. So I think what needs to happen is to discuss about patients. Is the question relevant? Is the design right? Is it ethical to run that? And not only from a technical ethical point of view, but is it relevant to patients? And then patients will join. Otherwise they won't, or they might drop off when they're being randomized, or they might drop off halfway through because there's no crossover in it, and they should be staying on that arm even if they progress. So from that perspective, that's why it's so important for us to discuss very early about the design, that we have a lot of good studies, and that we avoid launching studies that will never recruit or never deliver, or deliver outcomes that nobody's interested in. I think that's the main thing. And I think we're working very hard on public perception of trials, that patients understand the importance of it and understand the safeguards, but also understand that they have a choice. And I would just add one more thing, which is really important. What we often say to patients, or at least I do, I say it's important to go to a trial center, because you might get best care even outside of a trial, because the trial center has all the expertise in there and they know what's going on. So all the safeguards, the educational mechanisms are there. And that's why a second opinion in a trial center is very important. And they might then join a study or not join a study. That's their personal decision in the end. But I think trials drive quality, and that's very important.
Dr. Ruhl, do you have any?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I totally support that. I mean, trials are not good because they're trials. That's just, if you're a patient, it's simply not right. I totally get that they're good economically. I also know that you may need them to become an oncologist. You need them for publications, presentations, all that kind of stuff. But as a patient, that's not what it matters to us. So a trial is good if it helps or increases your chances to survive. If you go backwards, then there are a subset of trials you want. We also know how it works, you know, competing trial centers, and you don't get sent forward to the next one, because then, you know, there's an admittance, like an alignment against the patient, and things like that, behavior like that undermines the trust in medical research. It's not the research that's the problem, it's the way how we currently conduct it. And then blaming it on the patient that they're not signing up for that, where the system is where the issue lies, I think is the wrong end to tackle it. If you could be certain that the trial you choose is the best for you, you solve the rest that is attached to it. And unfortunately, we've had some I think we all know the horrendous studies that have been conducted, especially in Africa. And I think we should not be surprised that there is a mistrust. And that's something we have to, I think, to acknowledge and to take account for. Just preaching at patients that trials are the best, it's not true. And I think it is also, and that's why I'm very, very, impressed by Dr. Bellow's approach, and just like very encouraged by that, because I believe it is these communities who have to start building their own trials, and that the trust will follow. Trust needs to be gained. We can't preach at people telling to trust. It is something we have to build over years. And I think showing that and building something that works and delivers value for patients, that's one thing. The other side, the flip side of it, is we do know that even today we have a bias in who enters trials. We know it is those who are better educated, who are wealthier, because these are the ones who usually have the means to go even looking to find out what a clinical trial center actually is. Lots of newly diagnosed patients in cancer especially, they've never heard of guidelines, they have often not heard about trials. So it is really then kind of getting to this level to be able, and it's just often it is educational that allows them to search differently. And that's something that we have been trying to address in our networks, just by making education like widely accessible and to everyone. But you see it over again. And for us, I mean, we are now, as you said, we're European, and just like we have lots of tiny countries and everyone insists on their own healthcare system. I mean, I know that the US is not much better with their state issues. But for example, you can't just go to another country to participate in a trial, because you will be liable to pay the cost to get there, and also the baseline cost, because usually because of the co-financing model, it is the sponsor that will pay the extra kind of imaging, extra analyses, but the baseline will be covered by the national healthcare system. So it is only those people who can afford to pay that baseline cost who will be able to join trials abroad. So there is, at the moment, how we're currently running trials, there is a selection like based on financial incentives in there. And we've been trying to do something about it, because I just think it is unfair. But yeah, I wish I had a solution for that.
Well, coming back to you then, Dr. Bello, you have raised the challenges in terms of trials themselves in Sub-Saharan Africa, and what strategies, beyond convening these meetings and creating this opportunities for collaboration, have you had opportunities to directly, through aortic or otherwise, educate patients about the importance and the opportunities presented in clinical trials?
So yeah, thank you very much. So the idea or the notion that really that a lot of people are not aware of clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa is not 100% true. There are a chunk of educated people that understand the role of clinical trials, and they actually travel abroad and pay the cost to be able to enroll in clinical trials. So that has been going on, and we want to make sure that this is being done here. I'll give you an example. You see, we are collaborating with PICE and some other pharma to do a clinical trial on nivolumab in my center. And this has been going on, we've developed protocol, and then for one reason or the other, it has not started. And a lot of the patients that have been educated about it have been coming forward to ask, when is this trial going to happen? So there is some awareness, and believe me, 86% of our patients that can afford care are not treated in Africa. They travel abroad to Europe, they go to the United States, and they can access clinical trials. So what we're saying is to educate them that, look, there must be some trust to develop capacity. What COVID has done is to show everyone that, look, if you don't develop your own health system, then you can run into trouble, because it can get a time where nobody can actually travel. So that's one of the lessons that we have learned from COVID. And I think as a result of that, a lot of the governments of different countries in Africa are looking inwards to provide funding, because I think funding is very critical in clinical trials. And with that, perhaps maybe the pharma, I'm happy that Moran is taking the challenge, that she will take it up. So it's not only about trust. You see, people rely on hearsay. A lot of people don't actually engage. Again, I go back to that. People don't engage research institute. We have fantastic research institute across the Sub-Saharan Africa. You've been to Africa and you've seen some of our hospitals, and I mean, we have capacity. So education, yes, is there. We will continue to engage the patients to understand the role of the clinical trials, but it's already there, even though it's not as much of in the United States or in Europe and so on. But we are continuing to do that, and we will continue to engage most of the organizations. There is one particular organization here in Abuja, Project Pink Blue, that has been going on to advocate for clinical trials, and they have involved even the Ministry of Health and so on and so forth. So yes, patients are very much aware, and they are really involved in educating policymakers to provide funding for clinical trials.
All right. This is a little bit of a reach, but each one of you have, given your perspectives. So in the last few minutes that we have, if I could ask for each one of you to give a 1-minute summary, is to say that if you had a magic wand, or you could influence direction policy and you had the money to do so, what is the one thing that you could do right now that you would want to see done as the next step in advancing cancer care and clinical trials and patient involvement? So if I can start with Mr. Geisler.
Well, I mean, if I had a magic wand, I want to actually really wish for something, then I would say that patients are involved in every study design, no matter whether they happen in the Western world, in low middle income countries, because I strongly believe in the partnership. And I think what Dr. Bello has said is extremely important. And we've seen it in the CML space between ICMLF, between fantastic clinicians in Nigeria, in Botswana, in Ethiopia, and Ghana, and so on. That the partnership of the patient community and the clinicians, and then also industry, really worked to drive also some of the research that we always wished for. And we've seen it in the Western world as well, and we're still not involved very often when it comes to study design. So if I had that kind of magic wand, I would say no research about us without us. So we should be involved at the design of studies when decisions are being taken, before that and not afterwards. That would be my wish.
Well, and you've so impressed people that there was a question to say from the U.S. Audience member to say, could they become involved with advocates? So if you want to put in the chat box some information, there might be people interested in learning from your experience. Thank you, Mr. Geisler. Moving on to you, Dr. Rao. How about, you've talked about many things that you have wanted to see done, that you worked on. What's the one thing that you'd like to see of all, if you can pick one, that you'd like to see effected?
So if I had a magic wand, I would use it that only clinical trials that fulfill Helsinki Article 8 in the purest sense of the term, namely that the patient interest, the individual on the trial interest, takes precedent over any other one. So only trials that would deliver real value to the single person on the trial by the person's standard would be allowed to run.
Thank you. Ms. Moran, you've been copiously taking notes. Now, which of those notes are you going to put at the top of your list?
Yes, I think it's hard to pick, but I think one of the big things for us as an industry would be to gain trust of the community and trust of various stakeholders in the ecosystem of healthcare. And part of that too is really being able to communicate and share perspectives. So a company perspective can be understood and recognized by a patient, and vice versa. A patient's lived experience, their carer's experience, can help inform companies, and they meet in the middle where there's been alignment and training and understanding where effective communication can occur. So I think it's really just building that capacity on both sides and governments to support as well to ensure that we're systematically integrating patient perspectives across the life cycle of the product.
Thank you. And Dr. Bello, the last word to you, sir.
Thank you so much. So I wish I have more than just one magic wand so that I can solve all the problems, but you have just given me only one. I will hope that clinical trials will increase in Sub-Saharan Africa by at least 30%, so that when I am treating a patient and when he's asking me, where is the clinical trial that you said that it is going to be the best care for me, I will be able to refer him to one or another clinical trial. Because the way it is now, we are only saddled with standard of care, drugs without any clinical trial. So we tend to hide that aspect of the NCCN guideline that says that the best form of treatment is in clinical trial. So we don't discuss so much of that with our patients because the clinical trials are simply not there. And I hope that the pharma will take it very seriously to come and engage academia in Sub-Saharan Africa so that we will have some form of Cleopatra trial sites in Africa, for example, and many other trials that could be so beneficial, because we do know that there is a lot of diversity in Africa and a lot will be learned globally from trials in Sub-Saharan Africa.
So thank you very much to all of the panelists, I mean, for your insights and wonderful suggestions. You know, here's a great opportunity for global collaboration relative to Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Bello and his organizations help define the need. We recognize the critical importance of the patient because that's at the end of the day what matters. And Ms. Moran is going to help make all of this, you know, support all of these efforts in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we look forward to hearing back about progress. So thank you to the audience also. I'm going to turn this over to Katie Wickford-Preschner, who's the NCCN Manager for Global Policy and Strategic Alliances, for her closing remarks.
Thank you so much. A sincere thank you for all our participants and everyone that joined the conversation today. I would like to thank Dr. Ko, as well as our really exceptional speakers. You really shared all of your expertise, insights, and engaged in a thought-provoking discussion, so thank you. I would also like to thank our supporters of this webinar series. As Dr. Carlson mentioned, really without your support, today wouldn't have been possible. And lastly, I would just like to thank the entire NCCN team for helping to organize this event, especially Lee Gallo, Mike Abrams, and Mark Geisler for all their hard work behind the scenes to make this webinar a success. Before we conclude, I hope that everyone will join us for our next two sessions on May 20th and May 27th. May 20th will really focus on patient-centered cancer care and survivorship. And our last session on May 27th will really focus on highlighting best practices for patient engagement in policy decision-making and advocacy. A sincere thank you again to everyone for joining. I apologize for not getting to all of your questions, but please feel free to reach out to the panelists. And we will be posting the recording on our website, so check back for that. Thank you again. Please continue to stay safe and have a good day. Bye.